So today is World AIDS Day, 1st of December, around the world, where Christians in particular, but also civil society, contemplate and think about the ways in which this particular disease, which has been such a prominent feature of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, has affected human life. Now, a couple of years ago, I wrote a little book called Christian and Positive. And in that book, a number of chapters, it was a compilation of various essays that I had published over the years in a number of scholarly journals. Let's see if we can get a copy of the book. I think it's here on my shelf. Yeah, there it is, Christian and Positive. And in this little book, I reflected on two things in particular. The first is that the church took a very, very long time to come to the point where it really began to address the issue of HIV and AIDS in South Africa. Now, I don't know if you know this, I don't know the latest statistics, but at the time of writing the book, which I think was in 2009, the statistics were that about 63% of all HIV positive persons lived in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's on the southern tip of Africa. I think it was something like 33.2 million people were HIV positive, and yeah, I mean it was a massive amount, something like 26 million of those lived in southern Africa. And for me the question was, in a context like this where there are so many persons who are HIV positive, what should the church be doing? And I made a rather controversial statement that got me into a little bit of hot water in the media. I was on various radio programs and in some newspaper articles, because I said that if your church in South Africa doesn't have an HIV/AIDS ministry, it cannot be Christian. Now, this particular notion was obviously overstated. Of course it can be Christian, but in some senses I was trying to make the point that Jesus himself would care very deeply about the contextual issues that we're facing in our communities or society. And if your church truly is the body of Christ, if it bears the image of Christ, the likeness of Christ, and does the kind of things that Christ himself would do in your context, then surely in a context where the largest number of persons in the world is HIV positive, every church should have an HIV ministry, ministry to persons who are HIV positive and have AIDS. And the issue was, as I identified it, that the church struggled with a theology around this particular disease. Now, in the mid-1980s, when HIV became a prominent issue on the global discourse, one of the problems was that Christians had this false notion that somehow those who were HIV positive were being punished by God, as if, and this is hugely logically problematic. I mean, disease is not connected with moral culpability or with sin. Of course, the issue there was that in the early days when HIV spread, it spread predominantly amongst persons who had a same-sex orientation, that conservative Christians had a problem with that, and amongst persons who shared needles, drug users. But of course, today we know that the most at-risk person for being HIV positive in the world is a young girl, a young woman, who's in that stage where she becomes sexually active. So between the ages of about 14 and into her mid-20s. And heterosexual women in particular are most vulnerable to being infected with HIV/AIDS through multiple sexual partners. And very often the issue here we found in South Africa is that women at that age are financially dependent upon men. So because of patriarchy and the way in which men still dominate society and dominate economics in the market, women are in need of men. And so very often these men are sexually inappropriate. They expect sexual favors from younger women. Maybe they have multiple partners and so they get infected. So the second thing that and the point that I made in the book was to say we moved from that sort of judging attitude to eventually recognizing that there were so-called innocents in HIV, so persons who contracted AIDS through their mother at childbirth, or persons who contracted AIDS through doctors, nurses, through needle stick injuries, etc. And of course, that language of innocence is problematic in itself, but the church began to awaken to this. The third step in the move was from judgment to innocence. The third step in that move, which I traced, was when we began to recognize that we have AIDS. Now, this is a very interesting thing. The Methodist Church of Southern Africa in South Africa, I think, was the first church that I'm aware of that made that statement. It said the body of Christ has AIDS. It was a very controversial statement at the time to say the body of Christ has AIDS. But of course, the point that they were making, based on 1 Corinthians, Paul's theology, if one part of the body suffers, we all suffer with it, was the point that if one part of the body is HIV positive, just like HIV operates in a human body, then all of us are affected. All of us may not be infected, but all of us are affected. And it was only when we began to make that move, when we stopped othering persons who were HIV positive, when we started recognizing that we ourselves have a role to play in this, that our theology began to change. And I remember in my own denomination for many years, we ran a campaign where each year bishops and ministers would have themselves tested. In fact, I've just undergone this last week. I went for a health test and I know my status. Do you? Because once you know your status, at least you can act upon it. So that was the first thing that I addressed in that chapter, was that we need to develop a healthy, responsible theology of HIV/AIDS that doesn't other persons who are HIV positive, that doesn't connect this disease with morality or somehow regard it as punishment for sinful behavior, but that recognizes this is a disease that people suffer from and the church has a responsibility to care. Then the second thing that I addressed in the little book, Christian and Positive Reflections on Christianity in an HIV positive world. I'll put a link to this in the show notes, by the way, and if you are interested to receive some of the articles, just drop me an email and I'll send them to you. The second thing that I addressed in there is what I entitled Empire, Economics and Apathy. And I asked the question, how was it possible in such a hugely Christian nation, South Africa, where at that stage 79% of the population indicated that they were Christian, that we could have one of the highest HIV infection rates in the world? I'm just changing my grip of my camera here. So how is that possible? If so many people are Christian and HIV is predominantly transmitted through heterosexual sex, how was that possible in South Africa? And there were three reasons for that I found. The first one was the notion of empire. Now, empire has to do with the establishment of political and social ideology in society. And in South Africa, during the Mbeki administration, you may remember that there was this absolutely crazy notion that Thabo Mbeki had, the president of South Africa at the time, that HIV and AIDS were not connected. And he refused to roll out antiretrovirals. And behind this notion, I developed this in the book and have some quotes to substantiate it, was the idea of the African Renaissance. And Thabo Mbeki was so committed to this notion of the restoration of the image of Africa and the African that he found it very difficult to accept the idea that people were sexually promiscuous, and that they found it very difficult to manage their sexual desire. And so because of this, he denied this issue around HIV and AIDS because of a political ideology, and hundreds of thousands of persons suffered and died because of the refusal to roll out antiretrovirals. The second thing I mentioned was economics, so empire, economics and apathy. The economics aspect was, in South Africa, the cost of rolling out antiretrovirals was very high. And there are two aspects to that. The one was the drug makers, people who were making the drugs, the antiretroviral drugs, were treating them as an economic commodity. Now, can you imagine anything more unjust than that? That people are suffering, there's a drug that can help them not to suffer, but because someone has this very scarce commodity, they price it very high in the market. And at that stage, it was almost impossible for the average South African. More than half of South Africa's population lives on less than $2 a day. And to get that drug cocktail that was necessary, antiretroviral cocktail, to extend life and bring it back to relative normalcy, was completely out of the range of most citizens. Of course, the Treatment Action Campaign and many other campaigners around the world managed to get the drug makers to provide generics for the drugs, which became very cheap. But still, the South African government refused to roll them out. And apparently one of the ideas for that, I have a quote from Trevor Manuel in the chapter that I wrote on this, was that they believed that if they provided antiretrovirals, the government would have to bear the cost of keeping a sick population alive. And so they would rather have people die than keep sick people alive. Now, how is that ethically possible in a Christian country? I find it absolutely mind-boggling. And then, of course, the third issue that I dealt with was apathy, empire economics and apathy. In such a largely Christian country, the church was simply not doing enough. It wasn't doing enough to care at the local level. It wasn't doing enough to transform and engage policy, to engage parliamentarians and parliament and lawmakers and express its rights through laws. And it wasn't doing enough as individual Christians, actually caring for people who are HIV positive, engaging in spreading the word that HIV is not only preventable, but if one contracts it, that you can live with it. So perhaps the question today is, on World AIDS Day, what is your theology of HIV/AIDS? Have you ever reflected on this? Do you still mistakenly buy into this idea that somehow it's a curse or a punishment for sinful behavior? Have you come to the point yet of recognizing that true solidarity in the body of Christ means that we all are HIV positive? If one person suffers, all of us do. Do you know your status? Have you recently been tested? That's a very, very important issue, and encourage others to do the same. So remember, this is not a lecture, it's just a thought, but I want to encourage you on World AIDS Day today to think, what would Christ require of us as Christians around the world where this disease is prevalent? And how can we support and love and show solidarity with all persons who are HIV positive? So thanks for watching today's video. I hope it hasn't been too shaky. I've been recording it once again on my iPhone. My Mac is still not working as it should, so I'm recording and editing on my iPhone. But thanks for watching. Please like the video if you found it useful. Share it, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment. Ask any questions, agree or disagree, and I'd love to hear from you. So thanks for watching.